In my opinion, this Thunderbird is the best looking Thunderbird of all time. I'm going to tell you why, and then I dare you to prove me wrong. Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution, here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, a great collection, more than 170 cars in Phoenix, to tell all kinds of great stories about how the automobile has evolved over the years, like this car right here, this 1964 Thunderbird. But before we can talk about this car, we really have to talk about the evolution of the Thunderbird. You know, it goes back to 1955, those two-seaters that ran between 55, 56, and 57. Today we call them the baby birds. A lot of people love those cars. But you know, even when those cars were being produced, the stylists, the engineers, the marketing people were realizing they needed something bigger. Why? Well, because the parents of the baby boomers were having babies, and they needed a place, a back seat for those kids to sit. And a two-seater, as much fun as it was, and yes, it definitely outsold the Corvette in its day, it wasn't enough room for the baby boomer parent generation. So in 1958, they came out with what today we call the Square Bird, a four-seater Thunderbird. And guess what? Sales went up even more. The idea of having a back seat where those kids could hang out, or maybe just bring another couple when you're out on a date, everybody loved that. The Square Bird, as we call it, went from 55 to 60. Now, some people, like me, like the styling of that car, but there are plenty of people who don't. It's not been one of the most popular Thunderbirds over the year. 1961, though, they came up with a new styling for that car. That is the car we call the Bullet Bird. Why? Well, if you look at the taillights, and Ford was using these in other cars at the time, they look like jet engine exhaust. There was no accident there. They wanted that jet styling. So those jet engine exhaust, and today we refer to that as the Bullet Bird. Great styling. Sold very well. Then 1964 came along and it was time to come up with a new evolution of the car. Remember, cars had to change regularly back then. And this is what they came up with. A beautiful restyling, an elegant restyling of that 1961 through 63 Bullet Bird. And once again, I think they absolutely nailed it with this design. Now, some people still lament and go, oh, I really wish they kept making those baby birds. You have to look at the sales numbers. Like the sales numbers, the best year of the baby bird was 1957, and they sold 21,000 of those cars. In 1963, the year before this styling, they sold 63,000 Thunderbirds. But in 1964, when this car came out, guess what? People loved it. They sold 92,000 of these cars. Now, you think about it. If you were a young executive in the mid-60s, you wanted a car, something that, well, maybe you had a station wagon to haul your family around in, but you wanted something to take to the country club or to take clients out to lunch with or dinner, or just have an elegant car that you could enjoy, could show that you were moving up in the world. This was a perfect example of what you would buy. And when you think about it, what else was there in the American landscape at that time? I mean, you had the Buick Riviera, but it didn't come in a convertible. You could go upscale to a Cadillac, but that was going to cost you a lot more. Chrysler, yeah, they had the 300, but it really wasn't this kind of personal, elegant luxury car. Some people would say, oh, well, there was also the Mercedes, you know, the 230, 250, 280 SL range during the 60s. But that was also going to cost you a lot more, and it wasn't as sleek and elegant as this car was. So if you were that young, up-and-coming executive, this was the car that you had on your radar. Because, I mean, look at it. It's beautiful, it's elegant, it's personal, and underneath that hood, we'll talk more in a moment, a 390 cubic inch engine with 300 horsepower. So it had performance, it had elegance, it had style. It was a personal luxury car that made a statement. And this is the car in 1964 that more than 92,000 folks said, yep, that's the one I want. Let's take a walk around and look at the styling of this 1964 Thunderbird, the fourth generation of the car. Now, the styling changes between the first three generations were pretty radical. I mean, between the Baby Bird in 57 and the Square Bird in 1958, and really between the Square Bird and the Bullet Bird between 1960 and 61. But the changes between 63 and 64 I would describe as more evolutionary. Now, they were very important and very significant, but it was really a subtle redesign in terms of the overall look. One of the significant changes that happened in 1964 was the elimination of a part of the fender that came down to a very sharp point right here. Now, I love the elegant line that they've created right here. One of the other things that happened is that the headlights, which were a little bit more inboard, moved a little further outboard. One of my favorite styling touches of this 1964 is this thing right here. If you take a look at it, it's actually a pretty complex piece of metalwork. I love the way it kind of comes up through here. It's got this indentation here, and then look at this little line right here with the surrounds for the headlights. It's actually very beautifully done. And of course, the turn signal indicators that are on the top of the hood right there are spectacular as well. As you go down the side of the car, once again, they call this the flare bird, and really this is why. Look at the way it flares up very subtly up over the door handle right here, and then down here it flares down very slightly. So you look at the flare up, the flare down, that's why they call it the flare bird. Now some people say this looks like a flare pin. Maybe, maybe not, but I think the flare is the styling that they're looking at for this car. We'll go inside in just a little bit, but I mean, look at the elegance of this back seat, the way it wraps around. I love the styling of all this. Speaker back here, it's just beautifully done. There's just enough leg room right there. Then we'll go in there in just a moment. Go to the very back of the car, and of course this was a significant change. And this is the change that everybody would notice, because they went from those round tail lights that were supposed to look like jet exhaust to these long rectangular sections. Now there's one thing in 1964 that they don't have that comes out the following year, and that is sequential taillights. Sequential taillights are where they come on and they flash from one side to the other. They had them ready for 1964, but they were concerned that some of the states had laws that might not allow it. And because they weren't quite sure, they decided to hold off for a year. So the sequential taillights don't actually come along until 1965. Now here's a question for you. How do you get into the trunk of this car? There's no place to put a key. There's no place for a key up there. That's because you really couldn't manually open the trunk of this car. This had a power top, the same kind of top they were using in the Lincoln. This opens up that way. But to open it up manually, well, that's a pretty complex thing to do. This is not the trunk you were going to throw your golf clubs in. If you want to do that, you'd get the hard top. This was a beautiful, elegant design, and look at the length, the vast expanse of this trunk section, we'll call it, even though you can't get into the trunk. Look at how beautiful that is and how it flows elegantly up towards the front of the car. Kelsey Hayes wheels, those wire wheels right there. Once again, just a beautiful design. Everything is so elegant about this. And of course, we've got this faux hood scoop at the front. Doesn't actually put cold air into the engine, but it was the styling that everybody liked at that point in time. A little bit different. I think in the 1963 it came more to an angle. This has a little bit of an angle to it, but not quite as much. But once again, the styling is what really makes this car stand out. It's just personal luxury, and more importantly, it is an elegant personal performance car. As much as I like the outside styling of this car, I love the inside. I mean, this to me was the epitome of personal luxury back in those days. I mean, it's really what they call cockpit styling to start with. It's because this is designed to wrap around the pilot, or in this case, the driver of the vehicle. And look at the way they've beautifully designed this dashboard. How it kind of comes across, makes this turn down, goes across here, and then this center console that goes all the way through the back of the car, ending up at that speaker at the top. So the folks in the back seat can actually enjoy the music as you're driving along. But once again, all designed to wrap around the driver. But in some cars where it wraps around the driver and leaves the passenger off on their own, this has enough room, it's got enough elegance on this side, so the passenger isn't feeling neglected. Pretty big changes between the 1963 and the 1964 Thunderbird. To start with, 1963 they had 3 big gauges on the dashboard. 1964, look at how they've changed. And now they've got this horizontal speedometer with these numbers that go across. Very different look for everything. There's got these 4 round pods down below that give you, your various gauges, oil, fuel, water temperature, amps right there. One of the other things that I really like about the 1964, in 1963, the radio was up here. 1964, they move it down below and they replace it with this beautifully elegant and yet aviation-inspired piece. It's got the clock in the center, and then look at these little actuators for controlling the wipers and the washers, the left air, the right air. Boy, I just love those things. You would just feel like you were literally in the cockpit of a jet aircraft as you were going along with those. Now, of course, as part of this beautiful console, we wouldn't put our, our window actuators, the buttons, the switches to control the power windows there. No, we'd elegantly put them here in the center so you could casually operate them as they went by. Remember cigarette ashtrays, cigarette lighters? Boy, there was a time when those were in just about every car. Looking once again at the way they've done this, though, I just love all the styling. Every single element of this is beautifully done. And of course, this particular car, the way they've got the two-tone with the white, boy, this is just elegant. And that back seat, once again, that looks like something, the way it wraps around, that you would actually find maybe in a, in a restaurant lounge where you'd be elegantly sitting there having a drink, waiting for someone to come up with you. It's just an absolutely beautiful car in every level. And once again, if you were that young executive, you were moving up in the world, you were heading out to the country club, boy, this is exactly what you'd want to be driving. One of my favorite elements are these things right here. They're the door handles. I love the way they've designed those. They almost look like winglets coming up on the side of an airplane. But in this case, it's just the handle you would use to open the door. But look how it beautifully fits your hand. Very ergonomic in that regard. But once again, it looks like it's absolutely aircraft inspired, like it's at the tail fin or some type of aeronautic element to an airplane. Just absolute beauty. Now, as I mentioned, under the hood of almost every Thunderbird produced in 1964 was a 390 cubic inch engine that produced 300 horsepower, what they call the Z-code engine. Now, here at the Martin Auto Museum, this is something special. This is a car that's been done up to look like a what-if car. This has a 428 cubic inch engine that's been installed to kind of imagine what it would have been like if they'd put one in. And I have to say, they did a great job. It almost looks like a stock installation. But while technically, there was really only one engine that was available in 1964. That was the 390. The thing I've learned about automakers, there was always something extra on the back burner. And in this case, it turns out that certain dealers were allowed to order as an option a 427 cubic inch engine. It produced 410 horsepower. It was the Q-code engine. As I understand, there are maybe 120 of those made. Who knows how many exist today? I'd love to get my hands on one or at least see one. This is the 428. Kind of a what if they had put that engine in this particular car. But once again, 99.9% of all the 64 Thunderbirds you're going to find have that 390 engine. And the 390 engine was a great engine. You know, it was from what they call the FE series. FE stood for Ford Edsel, kind of came out of that line. The FE is the block that replaced the old Y block that had the kind of the deep section at the bottom. Now, it was a great engine. I think in its lowest form, it had about 330 cubic inches or so, eventually evolved up to a 428 like we see right here. So it produced a lot of different engine variations, and they ran all the way up through the 70s on that engine block, so it was a great run. Now in 1963, you did have more engine options available. For 1964, they decided, you know, we want to simplify things, and technically there was really only one engine that was available. In later years, they came out with other engines that you could put into this car. They decided to put more horsepower up front. So for 1964, you think about it though, horsepower was just beginning to come on. 300 horses out of that 390 cubic inch engine with this beautiful, elegant styling. It was exactly the package that, once again, that young executive wanted as they were heading out to the country club. I do want to give proper credit to the guys who designed this. A guy by the name of L. David Ash, together with a guy named Art, and I believe his name was pronounced Querfeld. They were under the direction of Ford design chief Gene Bordenat, and they're the ones who came up with the styling for this flare bird. Sales for this fourth generation of the Thunderbird overall were pretty strong. In the 3-year run between 64, 65, and 66, they sold a total of 236,000 of these. Now in 1967, they took a huge turn in terms of where the Thunderbird was going to go. To be honest with you, I'm not a big fan of what I call that Landau styling from 1967 on. It really became more of a luxury car. I think they were trying to think of a competitor for the Lincoln world, which I'm not sure made sense. They got away from this sporty luxury styling that they had in this mid-year, the 64, 65, 66. And when you look at the sales numbers, I mean, overall, that next generation, 67 through 71, sold relatively well. But while it sold more in terms of total numbers than this fourth generation, it's also because they had 5 years of sales and not just 3 years of sales. Now, I will point out that if you were buying a personal luxury car, a personal performance car back in those days, you had your choice, as I mentioned, you know, this, or in my opinion, really the Buick Riviera was the best competitor for this. But this actually cost more. The basic coupe version of this was going to cost you about $4,600. If you wanted the convertible version like this one, it was going to cost you nearly $5,000. The Buick Riviera did cost a little bit less, although you could load it up with options and end up spending more. But if you wanted a Cadillac, well, you were going to be well into the $5,000 range right off the bat. And a Cadillac convertible, well, you were going to drive it up even more. So in my opinion, this was the perfect car for just about everything. It had just the right performance under the hood. It had just the right amount of style inside this cockpit. It had the perfect elegant style on the outside, and it was at the right price point. Remember, that young executive moving up in the world had some cash to spend, and as a result, this is the kind of car that they would have been going for. And remember, in 1964, they sold more than 90,000 of these things. So, in my opinion, this car right here, this 1964 Thunderbird, is the best Thunderbird ever made. And I dare you to prove me wrong.